Be bold, be brief, and be gone. That was the WhatsApp I got. But it's a pleasure having you here today. Have you guys enjoyed today? Yeah. So I wanted to wrap up and maybe be positive. I think when you started the conversation, some of us are a bit negative, like, guys, it's too negative. So I've been told to come here, Isaiah, and make some jokes and make it positive again and talk about what we do next, right? So I want to talk about a topic called a path to inclusive growth. Right? We had our economists earlier start off the conversation laying out the landscape, and we've had a really good panel about the potential and what's going on. And of each one of you, you've been at these conversations before, but I want to wrap up with things you may know, but I'm hopeful that it's provocative, and you go back thinking, that's interesting, what do I do with it, right? So let's start that conversation. So one of the key things worth noting is that like my home country of South Africa, the Kenyan population is actually quite young. How young, you may ask? The average Kenyan is about 19.6 years. That's an interesting stat. So you ask, why is it interesting? The average European is 45 years old, right? The average Asian, whether it's China or India, is still older than us, right? So earlier today, when we spoke about the age of this population, we are the world's workforce in future. So whether it's 2035 or whether it's 2030, we're going to have the world's largest mobile workforce. As the world ages out and the replacement ratio, as we say, drops off, we will need people to work the economy. This is our African population across our 54 countries. So as we think about this youth population of diversity, cultures, tribes, gender, Africa is key to where the world needs to be. And this is important thing to think about, is that if we realize that the potential of Africa is in our people, right, then actually we'll think about what we do next. Now, when I think about the population, it's interesting. There aren't that many old people in Kenya, right? Some of us behave like we're old, but actually we're not. So if we look at the population above 65 years, it only makes up about 4% of our population, right? Over 60% of the Kenyan population is actually in what we call the working age, which is 15 to 64. So we've got the workforce, it is happening right now. So key thing to take away today is that we've got the youth, we've got the diversity, we've all these infinite possibilities. What are we doing to empower them? The biggest challenge I have, from my vantage point, looking after the continent of businesses that we have, is that we aren't able to spot the potential in me. I remember buying my first car when I first started work, and I don't know how you dress up to go buy a car, James. You dress up, you put a suit on. And I remember clearly I had jeans and like a dirty t-shirt. I probably didn't shave that day. And the person looked at me, made a judgment call. This guy can't afford to buy a car. So I came back on the Monday, shaven, had my suit on. I was working at Accenture. And I bought the car from another sales guy, right? Because we judge perceptive. We make a call based on, do you like me, on how I sound, my accent, do you like our suit? That is who we are. So what the previous panel, James, Mumbi, Eva, Angela spoke about was what we're doing to drive the inclusion of new population groups. And it's what that practically means. So we've got the population, they are here, they're young. Can they be seen? Javed, when you look at these young population, do we have the mechanisms as the banks, as the lenders, to actually see their potential? Now, a large part of what we've been doing in our African business since 2018 is finding ways to use different techniques, because not everything we do in Kenya is mainstream banking. We have a highly banked population, but we still have more people using M-Pesa. Some 56 million people use the M-Pesa technology. We aren't looking for traditional ways. But if we use traditional techniques to decide whether Lee is a good guy or a bad guy, you may come out short, because I don't live in the way that you'd like me to live. I don't work in the way you think I should work. It's a prescribed way of working. In my country, where I come from, our bureau is 121 years old, one of the oldest bureaus in the world. We've had a challenge where we think about people, about decisioning. In my country, unemployment is even higher than here. Unemployment is 32.6% in my country. So I want to think about new ways to see your potential. So we spoke about hope earlier. How do I see hope? How do I see your dreams and your vision? That all sounds philosophical. Here's the cool thing. It is very possible. The techniques, you don't need to go as fancy as Satoyo mentioned this morning about artificial general intelligence. We've got techniques we've been using for the last 5 years that now allow us to see potential in people and not just what's wrong with them. So the first point is potential. We have a young population, over 60% in the working age group. The growth of the Kenyan market is actually driven in future by us being able to find this young and youthful population. The second thing is that the Kenyan population is actually living longer. It's really interesting. You know, they're saying now that the kids being born today could actually live up until they're 121 or 120 years, around that group, right? That's a long time. I don't have savings for that long. So not that I want to die, but I don't have savings to get to 120. So now the average age has increased. I think back in 2006, the average age was around 49. At the moment, it's between 64 and 68, right? That's today's population. Now, why is that the case? It's not just because people are living longer, because we're eating better food and all that good stuff. Africa is actually full of potential. If you think about Africa and you ask the first world, what are their concerns in Africa? They will say there's 3 things, right? And they always say the same 3 things. And I think Kenya is starting to address these 3 things. So what are the 3 things? Lack of accountability, lack of transparency, and a lack of leadership, right? These are things that scare the first world. Corruption, our names come up, Kenya, South Africa, the whole continent. They don't understand the dynamics of the continent we're on. So we've started to address that. Family planning, financial literacy, we've spoken about this earlier. It's key to the evolution of the Kenyan economy. So now look at the data, we're starting to see that already. We're starting to see a population where we're starting to understand better how to live our lives, how to participate in the economy. What is financial inclusion? It's worth reminding ourselves. It's giving a Kenyan access to a place to start saving their money. It didn't say in a bank account, it didn't say in a branch, it could be in a wallet, right? The world's mobile wallet market is $1 trillion. 70% of that sits in Africa. We've changed the way the world works. I would like to believe that in the COVID pandemic, the world bent itself to be more like Africa. I was telling Satoyo in the break earlier, I believe that M-Pesa could be the rails of the economy of Africa. This way of thinking. We don't need to use fancy words, blockchain, distributed ledgers, but this is a standard way of working. How do you embrace this way of working? So a large part of the population has different needs. Now, for this gentleman up on the screen, we are geared to work in a certain way. We may not have saved for longer, whether it's financial products or investment products or literacy or education. We are starting to grow older. And what we're starting to see from our vantage points is that the products that we are building as lenders are not geared for this older population. Now what's interesting, I said to you that 60% of the population is in the 15 to 64 age group, 3% is above 65, right? But the population will live longer. One of the challenges to think about, not for today or for tomorrow, but over the next 5 years is, are we starting to think about a new segment that your products need to talk to? I don't think we are. We are relying on my first point, that we have a youthful population, but our people will live longer. Not because we eat well and we have access to really good products, but with family planning and literacy, which is things that we're driving from an SDG perspective from the United Nations. We're driving this differently. Our people will live longer. So how do we cater with the diversity of people that are making up the Kenyan economy? Now, what's super interesting about the Kenyan economy is that a large part of your economy is actually driven by informal, right? So informal economy probably accounts for probably 15 or 16 million of the people that are employed today. So back in 2022, I think the number was, there's about 22 million employed people, of which about 18 to 19 actually from the informal economy. Now this is really important, what I say next. I think Angela mentioned it as well, but let me say it again. Throughout the pandemic, which is the one segment that every government around the world said, we need to protect this segment? It wasn't big business, right? It was small business. It was what you call MSME in Kenya, we call SMME. MSMEs, they typically create 2 to 3 jobs for their small businesses, right? 2 to 3 jobs. And as we create 2 to 3 jobs, we create more employment. And what we have a challenge with right now is, we still have challenges in Kenya. The real challenge to feed the challenges we have on the demand side of the economy is us to create and enable these new MSMEs. Remember, every MSME, whether it's in the township and it's a small or it's a bigger business that's doing something in the fintech part of the world, they're starting to create new jobs. And the question for us as industry, whether we're a bureau or whether we're a fintech, is how do we enable MSMEs? Now, this is a real thing that came up during the pandemic. If we don't protect the sector, unemployment just shoots up. And that was happening. So a large cohort of your employed population actually comes from the informal part of your economy. Your informal economy makes up over 30% of your entire GDP. So it's important, right? Not everybody's going to look like you or look like me, but that's the diverse and the beauty of the culture of Kenya. Different tribes, different peoples, rural, urban. How do we come together, right? That's what the presidency wants for the economy, right? What is the aspiration for Silicon Savannah? We want to be, as Kenya, I'm calling myself Kenyan because it's a good story, by 2030, we want to be an upper middle income country. That's the aspiration. And we're not doing badly as Kenya. I think your story is not being told beyond the boundaries, because this is stuff like I've read and I've learned about. But this is who we want to be, as the Kenyan country. How do we do more to actually make this happen? So the informal sector is key to success. But all the key organizations and lenders we work with, in my view, aren't doing enough for the MSME sector. Now, why is this the case? It's difficult to figure out whether what Lee says is a great idea. So I want to sell plantains online. Is it a good idea? I don't know. If I request money from Tala, will Tala give me money? I don't know. Maybe it will. But will a large bank or player actually give me money for an idea that is not asset-backed? They can't see the physical asset. These big ideas we have across Africa, whether it's Jumia, Flutterwave, Tala, Safaricom, these are all players in this new world of working. What we have found as TransUnion is that it's hard to profile a business that doesn't feel like something you can touch and see. But now you see these massive share prices for all the potential in these digital era businesses. So one of the things we spoke about in the panel, which I'll reiterate here, our focus to help the Kenya market is to now figure out how we can support the MSME creation, right? So I may have the best idea, James, and I come to you and say, I have the best idea, right? And you said, you may have the best idea, but I can't tell you whether you're good or bad. And this point of hope and potential is key to how we're showing up as TransUnion. If we can find a way to help convince you that Lee is good, not today, Lee's on the pathway to be good. In 3.2 months, you can provision for the risk, but you need to back the fact that potentially is what will help us grow. So the key takeaway here is that your MSME sector, your informal economy is a large part of employment. So if we assume there's 22 million employed people, then a majority, call it 16 million, come from your informal economy. So whether you're KCB, right, whether you own Mutual, whether you're Tala, whether you're Britain, how are you putting together the services to enable these MSMEs? MSMEs, they're not in the room generally, they're smaller. These are micro businesses. They don't feel and look like us. And the example I'd make is if we can find a way to see their potential, they will create those 2 to 3 to 10 jobs, and that feeds back on the demand side of the economy. Let's not be foolish. With all the growth we still have in Kenya, we still have about 9 million people living in extreme poverty, right? Kenya is not an equal society, even though we're getting better every single day. The question is, are we going to focus on the people that you can profile, or are we going to focus on those that haven't been pulled up? That's what financial inclusion is. And I made the point earlier about the pandemic. It fast-tracked our relevance into digital. It allowed us to say, why can't I have a digital bank account? Why must I walk into a physical branch? And that's why we now have $1 trillion global mobile wallet market. And that's the point I made to Satoyo. Shouldn't this be the rails of our future African economy? That's the potential we have. So, talking about financial inclusion, it's important to understand the point I made earlier. Kenya has come a long, long way. In fact, the data I have is that Kenya is probably one of the more included societies in sub-Saharan Africa. There's about 83% of your population that are financially included, right? So we have access to technologies, to digital accounts. We're able to transact. That's how we live our lives, right? We have all these ways of transacting. But there's still a cohort of the population that actually is not engaging beyond the basic account. Now, in your Kenya population, call it 55 million, there's only about, I think, maybe 40% that use the banking system, right? Now, you ask yourself, why? And I think some of this was covered in the previous panel. We have some cultural orthodoxies that prevent us. For example, women is probably the biggest challenge we have in Africa. I was with our Rwandan government a couple of months ago, and we're talking about what can we do to better profile the potential in women. And I thought to myself, what does the government mean? The reality is that historically, women have been disenfranchised. Your role's been predefined. At the household, the person that makes the food, while the husband works, while the family works. But that potential now needs to be realized. So that overcorrection now needs to happen. So it may be true that 82% of the population is financially included. But if we split it on gender lines, it actually is not that balanced, right? So how do we overcorrect on these injustices? Now, it's not to overcorrect on doing something incorrect. We are seeing the potential in people, and how do you reach out and pull their hand up? There's potential, and you've got to find new ways to do so. I'll give you a quick example. In my country, there's a court case, I think in 2021. It was a court case where a street vendor that sold flowers wanted to buy a car, right? And she goes into a dealership and I want to buy a car. She can't get the car. She doesn't have a payslip. Right? And the view is, I've got the money, I have a thriving business, it's part of the informal economy, and she goes to court. And the judge rules that you can't disenfranchise anybody because they don't work the way you'd like them to work. So now you're not allowed to discriminate in the upstream application process when the person doesn't have 3 payslips. Right? Now, is that risky? As a bank, oh my God, that's crazy. How do I profile you? But there's other ways to do so as well. The pressure that would apply on our economy was that as you look to bring people into the earliest part of their growth into credit, how do you better see their potential? The challenge was on us, and now we actually have solved that challenge. So that's something to think about. I want to just go back before I wrap up on this slide about financial inclusion. We are highly included as a Kenyan population, call it 82%, 83%. When you split it on the gender lines, it's not so equal. So as a lender, what are we doing? As a fintech, as a bank, as a short-term insurer, as a life insurer, what are we doing to find services that talk to the needs of women, right? Of different communities. We all are not the same. We've got to recognize this in how we lend and how we apply our decisioning. The second point I'll make on the slide is that we need to realize that we still have a group of people, some 9 million, that are lower or they earn less than the UN International Poverty Line. Let's call it 9 million. In my country, which we have the exact same population, around 55, our extreme poverty number is 18.2 million, right? So it's even harder. You made a lot of progress as Kenya, but we can't forget this cohort of 9 million. So that's an important point for me. Now, it isn't all doom and gloom. There's some things you've been doing as a country. I mentioned earlier the Silicon Savannah, which we all know about, right? It's been driving investment, and the bigger impetus behind setting up Silicon Savannah was to make Kenya an upper middle income country by the end of 2030, which is not too far away. Some of the stats I've mentioned today are quite powerful. The inclusion, the improvement has improved. Your inclusion to 82% It's actually moved really quickly. It moved 25 percent points in 1 decade. That's good stuff. And I think we don't stop enough to actually pat ourselves on the back and say, guys, good job, what's next? So there's today's story to make it positive is say, we're doing so much good as Kenya, but what's next? So the point about Silicon Savannah is the point that investment is available, right? The point about Silicon Savannah is an example of how we can collaborate together. Now in the room, look to your right, turn and look to your right, Angela. Is that guy there? Then look to your left. These are your competitors, right? It's like, and you're saying to yourself, Lee, the guy wrote the idea down. I hope he doesn't steal my idea because I wrote the same idea down. However, one of the powers of Kenya, which is better than any of the countries I work in, is your speed to value is quicker because you collaborate. So I want to remind you that your aspiration as an economy to be upper middle income by 2030, it requires you to focus on solving the right problems together. Right? I'll give you an example about the panel that you were on previously. If you think about the value chain, right, or the journey of buying a car, buying a product, you may see an example of a car. Britain would like to sell insurance to the car owner, right? The vehicle finance house would like to provide finance for the vehicle. The dealership and the OEM would like to sell the vehicle. It's all the same vehicle to the same person. We all have distinct, unique journeys and not the same journey. If those 4 players came together, you would do a couple of things. You'd have a seamless digital experience where you'd reduce friction. And secondly, it'll be a lot more cost efficient in how you render that service to the public. Simple example, 4 players in a value chain that have distinct journeys of how they come together. If we can do this, we can speed up value and get people included and accessing finances. I gave you an example of a car. Think of the 9 million people that live at the poverty line. Are we gearing up to bring them into our economy? So Silicon Savannah is good. We've made a start, but they're not in the room today, right? There's things like M-Kopa that came out of Silicon Savannah. We know this. But that's one example. Where's the next 20? And why aren't they in this room? Why do you need someone that says, I'm a fintech, and I use my Nike sneakers? Why can't it be one of us that uses suits, right? We decide what we do. And then to think about the fact that we do have excellence. I've dropped a couple of names across Africa. We think of Jumia, Flutterwave, we think of M-Pesa, Safaricom, M-Kopa. These are examples I use when I do my talks on the continent. We have excellence. One of my biggest call to actions for the Kenya group specifically, I look after many countries. I think Kenya, Angela, has the best stories, except no one knows about them. Do you guys get this point? I've given you probably 10 data points that tells you how great you're doing as a country. I had to go and find it under a rock. It wasn't even there. To pick up the rock and say, what's going on? You've grown 25% points in inclusion in 1 decade. Do you guys get this? That's the potential in the economy. So my call to action is that we've done so well as an economy, but now we're going to be judged. We're going to be judged whether we do the same thing and plateau out, or whether we jump this innovation curve, as we say, and we focus on this next cohort. So there's 2 things I want you to leave with, right? 1, you have 9 million people living in extreme poverty. Are you gearing up to bring them into this formal economy? Part number 1. And then part number 2 is, MSMEs are key to the growth of the economy. It already represents the majority of employment. If your business is not gearing to support MSMEs, you've missed an entire growth vector for your business, in my view. The biggest players are, for example, Time Bank in South Africa bought Retail Capital in December 2022. Immediately, they were able to extend 43,000 loans to small businesses, right? Another example of financial inclusion, the same bank went to the Zion Christian Church, which has 17 million people that belong to this church. Got them all on to get them entry-level bank accounts. They access in the first step in financial inclusion. It's a journey. So this is a talk of hope. It's the final talk for today before we wrap up, and Morris, wraps up the potential you have. For me, from a regional president perspective, you've done so well, but we can't be complacent, right? Earlier today we spoke about the growth of the African economy, right? The stats are that at a continental level, We're 0.2% off. We think it'll be 3.8% growth at the continent. At the same time, the global GDP is going to grow at about 2.6 to 2.8%. We are growing from a lower base, absolutely. We are beating the odds with all of our challenges. So when they say we're full of corruption and no accountability and no transparency leadership, we are still doing well. Imagine when we get our act together, guys. Do you see the potential? So my call is a call to action. My call is a call of hope. And I trust that you will take this back and use all these wonderful insights to think about how you will drive an inclusive economy. And that is the pathway to growth for our economy. We will be successful as Africa. There's no doubt. We get to decide how long it'll take. Thank you all for the opportunity.